No human has ever passed the Vethori resonance threshold, the examiner said. Not in 14 years of testing. I want to be clear about that before we begin. Nolan Reyes said nothing. He was looking at the ceiling of the testing chamber, which was made of some kind of pale composite material that reminded him faintly of the gymnasium at his old high school in Thunder Bay, and thinking that if he failed this evaluation, he was going to have to call his mother and explain why he had spent his entire savings flying to the Vethori assessment station in the outer Kessel transit corridor. She had not been enthusiastic about the trip. She had been, in fact, specifically and vocally unenthusiastic in the way that only his mother could be, which involved a long silence followed by a very quiet question about whether he had considered simply applying to work at the mill like his cousin Derek. He had considered it. He had considered it seriously. Derek made a reasonable living and had not recently spent 48 hours on a connecting transit to be told by an alien examiner that no human had ever passed a resonance threshold in 14 years. I understand, Nolan said. The examiner, whose name was a series of tonal clicks that the translation matrix rendered imperfectly as something resembling Sarvith, regarded him with the particular patience of someone who had explained the same thing to many people and watched most of them leave disappointed. The Vethori were not unkind, by reputation. They were precise. They had a deep and genuine commitment to accurate information, which meant they tended to say things like, "No human has ever passed this test," before administering it, because they considered false hope to be a form of disrespect. Nolan appreciated that, in theory. In practice, standing in a testing chamber in borrowed transit clothes with his certification exam fee already non-refundable, it was moderately difficult to appreciate. The resonance evaluation was not a physical test. That had been the first surprise when he'd looked it up 2 years ago on a second-hand data terminal in a break room at the shipping depot in Sudbury, where he'd worked the overnight sorting line. He had expected something involving equipment, maybe a pilot aptitude assessment or a manual skill demonstration. What the Vethori actually tested for was harder to explain, and depending on who you asked, harder to fake. They called it Veth, which the translation matrix handled poorly, and most human researchers rendered as something between coherence and resonant alignment. It was the measurable quality of a mind operating in genuine integration with itself. No suppressed signals, no cognitive dissonance, no gap between what a person believed and what they were doing and why. The Vethori considered it the single most reliable predictor of competence across any discipline, which was why Vethori-certified operators commanded twice the contract rates anywhere in the charted coalition territories and why the waiting list for an assessment slot was typically 8 months long. Humans rarely tested well. This was not, the Vethori were careful to explain, a judgment about human worth or capability. It was simply that human cognition tended to generate significant background noise. Ambivalence, unresolved conflict, the low-level static of wanting one thing while doing another, that interfered with the resonance read. Most humans scored in the low measurable range, which was still useful for certain contract classifications, and the assessment was considered worth attempting regardless. A passing score had never been recorded from a human candidate. Nolan had found this information 2 years ago and had spent approximately 45 seconds deciding it didn't apply to him, which was either confidence or a specific kind of foolishness that he still hadn't fully sorted out. Sarvith gestured toward the assessment seat, a low curved chair in the center of the chamber surrounded by the delicate lattice of the resonance reading apparatus. Nolan sat down. "The process takes approximately 20 minutes, Sarvith said. There is nothing required of you except to remain still and not attempt to perform. Any effort to influence the reading will register as interference. The most accurate results come from candidates who simply exist without agenda." "Just sit here," Nolan said. "I can do that." Sarvith's expression, the Vethori equivalent of skepticism, involved a very slight rearrangement of the bioluminescent markings along the side of the face. Nolan had learned to read it from the research documentation he'd studied during the transit. Most candidates say that. Most candidates find it considerably more difficult than anticipated. Nolan looked at the middle distance and thought about nothing in particular. He was good at that. He had been told, at various points in his life, that this quality was a sign of low ambition, insufficient drive, a personality that lacked the appropriate edge. His secondary school guidance counselor had called it drifting. His first foreman at the depot had called it checking out. His mother, with more affection than the words conveyed, had simply called it very Nolan. What it actually was, as far as he had ever been able to determine, was that he had never had much difficulty being exactly where he was. He did not spend a great deal of energy wishing he were somewhere else or someone different. He worked the jobs in front of him without resentment, rested when he could, found things interesting when they were interesting and uninteresting when they weren't, and had a consistent and genuine absence of the background anxiety that seemed to occupy most of the people he had ever known. This was not a philosophy, it was not a practice. He had not cultivated it, or worked toward it, or read about it in any framework. It was simply how he was, in the same way that some people were left-handed or had a good sense of direction. He sat in the chair. The lattice hummed faintly. 20 minutes passed. Sarvith had not moved from his position near the chamber wall. He was watching the read display with the focused attention of someone waiting for an expected result, which was how he had been watching it for the first 18 minutes, and was still watching it, when something changed at minute 19 that caused him to go very still. Nolan noticed the stillness because Sarvith had been making small, habitual movements, a shift of weight, a minor adjustment of his position, throughout the assessment, and then he stopped making them. "Is something wrong?" Nolan asked. "Do not speak during the assessment, sorry." Another minute passed. Then Sarvith crossed the chamber in 3 steps, looked at the read display from directly in front of it, and turned to look at Nolan with an expression that was not, as far as Nolan could read it, skepticism anymore. "The assessment is complete," Sarvith said. Nolan stood up. His left foot had gone partly numb from the chair and he shook it out quietly, which was not a dignified thing to do in a moment of potential significance but was necessary. "How did it go?" Sarvith looked at him for a long moment. "I need to confirm the reading with a secondary system," he said. "This has not happened before and I want to be accurate." "That sounds like either very good or very bad news." "It is," Sarvith said carefully, "unprecedented news. Please remain in the chamber." The secondary confirmation took 40 minutes, and involved 2 additional Vethori technicians who arrived with the particular urgency of people who had been interrupted from other things, and were not yet certain whether being interrupted was justified. Nolan waited. He sat back down in the assessment chair because it was the most comfortable option available, and watched the 3 Vethori confer over the read display in what he assumed was their native tonal register, which the translation matrix made no attempt to process. He could tell, from body language and bioluminescent signaling, that they were not arguing. They seemed, if anything, deeply and quietly puzzled. After 40 minutes, Sarvith returned to him. "The secondary read confirms the initial assessment," Sarvith said. "Okay," Nolan said. "You have recorded the highest Veth coherence score in the history of this station's human assessments." Nolan absorbed it. "I score." "The passing threshold for Vethori certification is 92, Sarvith said. Coalition candidates typically range between 60 and 85. Human candidates have historically ranged between 40 and 68. He paused. "You scored 114. Nolan was quiet for a moment. One of the technicians across the room made a sound that the translation matrix rendered with obvious uncertainty, as that is not a number that occurs. "Is that possible?" Nolan asked. "It is evidently possible," Sarvith said with the tone of someone updating their model of reality in real time. "We have not previously had occasion to find out. The scale does not technically have an upper bound, but in practical terms, scores above 100 have been considered theoretical, because no one had scored that high, because we had no empirical data suggesting it was achievable. The Vethori scale is based on observed ranges." Sarvith appeared to be choosing his words with unusual care. "You have extended the observed range." Nolan looked down at his hands for a moment, which were the same hands that had sorted packages on the overnight line in Sudbury for 3 years, and thought about calling his mother. He decided to wait until he had a better understanding of what he was calling her about. "What does this mean for the certification?" he asked. Sarvith took a breath, a very deliberate breath, the Vethori equivalent of composing oneself. "Technically, it qualifies you for any contract classification in the Coalition Registry. In practice, a score at this level would typically indicate suitability for Vethori command assessments." He paused again. "Those assessments do not have a human applicant category because no human has qualified." "Yes." Nolan stood up from the chair. His left foot had gone numb again, but he ignored it this time. "I'm not looking for a Vethori command position," he said. "I just need the standard operator certification so I can qualify for the deep transit freight contracts." There was a silence in the chamber that felt, to Nolan, entirely out of proportion to what he had just said. "The freight contracts," Sarvith repeated. Out of the Kessel corridor, mostly. There's a regular ag supply run to the outer colonies that requires Vethori certification for the pilot classification, and I've been working toward the qualification for about 2 years. Sarvith looked at him with an expression that had moved, over the course of the last 40 minutes, from professional detachment through careful uncertainty to something that Nolan could only describe as a kind of baffled respect. You sat in this chamber with a score that has not previously been recorded, Sarvith said slowly. In pursuit of a freight contract. It's a good contract, Nolan said. The rates are stable and the routes are well mapped. One of the technicians behind Sarvith made a sound. Nolan could not read the bioluminescent response precisely. But the translation matrix offered, this one is serious, as its best approximation, with a noted uncertainty flag. The certification paperwork took 2 hours. This was, Sarvith explained, because the standard human certifications scores above 100, and the administrative system required manual override authorization from the station director. The station director was a Vethori official named something the matrix rendered as Dovrak Se, and she arrived in the certification office 12 minutes after being contacted, which Nolan later learned was fast enough to be unusual. She was older than Sarvith, with the deeper bioluminescent patterning that indicated seniority, and she looked at the read display, then at Nolan, then back at the display, with the methodical attention of someone making sure they were not misreading something. You are the human candidate, she said. Nolan Reyes, he said. From Thunder Bay. I am not familiar with Thunder Bay, Northern Ontario. It's on Lake Superior. There's a large grain terminal and a casino. Dovrak Se appeared to be filing this information away, for reasons she hadn't yet determined. Sarvith tells me you are seeking freight operator certification. Yes, not a command classification, no. She studied him for a moment with the same focused, assessing quality that Sarvith had used, but there was something additionally curious in it, something less evaluative and more genuinely interested. May I ask why not? Nolan considered the question. It was not an unreasonable one given the circumstances, and Dovrak Se did not seem to be asking it dismissively. She seemed to be asking it the way someone asks a question they genuinely do not know the answer to. I like freight work, he said. I've done it for a long time. The deep transit routes are quiet, the logistics are interesting, and you spend a lot of time in places that most people don't bother going. I'm good at it. The score you have just recorded would qualify you for roles considerably more prestigious than freight operation. Prestige isn't really what I'm after. Dovrak Se was quiet for a moment. The bioluminescent markings along her face shifted in a pattern Nolan couldn't read. That is a very unusual statement from a candidate of your caliber. I'll take your word for it, Nolan said. I don't have a lot of comparison points. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the administrative authorization tablet and signed the override. The certification is approved, she said. Standard operator classification, deep transit eligible. She set the tablet down. I am required to note for the record that your assessment result will be filed with the Coalition Registry and may generate scientific inquiry. The Vethori Research Division has an active interest in understanding the Veth range in human candidates. That seems reasonable. They will likely contact you. I figured, Nolan said. He picked up the certification document, which was printed on a composite material that was slightly heavier than paper and smelled faintly of whatever the Vethori used in their printers. Thank you for the override authorization. It was not a difficulty, Dovrak Se said. It was in fact one of the more straightforward decisions I have made today. She was watching him with the curious, considering attention that was, Nolan would think later, the Vethori version of not quite letting someone leave yet. He had seen it in Sarvith, too, that slight pause before final dismissal, as if they were hoping he would say something else and weren't sure what they wanted it to be. He picked up his bag from the floor and put his certification document inside it. The ag supply runs out of the Kessel corridor, Dovrak Se said as he moved toward the door. The outer Veln route is the longest and least traveled. Most pilots find it isolating. It sounds good, Nolan said. She made a sound that the translation matrix flagged as not a standard response category and offered no further translation. The problem with the outer Veln route was not the isolation. Nolan had been right about that part. The route ran through a stretch of unmapped transit corridor where the signal relays were sparse and the nearest coalition hub was 3 standard days behind you, and most of the pilots who tried it came back early citing equipment anxiety or loneliness or the specific and documented psychological weight of deep silence, which apparently got to people in ways they didn't expect. It didn't get to Nolan. He found the silence comfortable in the way he had always found quiet comfortable. Not as an absence, but as a kind of clarity. He ran his pre-transit checks methodically, ate his meals on schedule, read the route documentation more carefully than most pilots bothered to, and found the long stretches of unmapped corridor genuinely interesting in a way he couldn't have fully explained to anyone who hadn't felt the same thing. The problem with the Outer Velm route was, in fact, Crav territorial proximity. The Crav were not technically a hostile species. They had a coalition treaty. They had designated territorial boundaries that were clearly marked on every navigation chart in the charted registry. They also had, periodically, a habit of testing those boundaries in ways that were technically non-hostile, and practically very inconvenient, particularly for freight pilots whose navigation systems occasionally had opinions about the most efficient routing that did not align precisely with the marked territorial lines. Nolan's navigation system did not, to be clear, have such opinions. His navigation system was well maintained and he had checked it twice before departure. The problem was that the beacon relay in Sector 7 of the Outer Velm corridor had been repositioned. Nolan would later confirm this in the maintenance logs, which showed a relay adjustment filed 3 days before his departure that had not yet propagated to civilian navigation databases, and that his ship, following a correctly functioning navigation system operating on outdated beacon data, ended up 3 degrees off its intended heading at the worst possible place in the route to be 3 degrees off heading, which was immediately adjacent to the current position of a Crav Border Patrol vessel. The patrol ship was twice the size of his freighter, and had the particular silhouette of something built with aggressive intent, which the Crav tended to favor in their military architecture, even when the vessel's actual mission was routine. It came alongside within minutes of his arrival in the sector, which told him that it had already been there and had seen him coming. Nolan put down his route documentation and looked at the proximity alert with the specific feeling of someone who had been having a perfectly reasonable day and was now watching it become something else. He did not panic. He had never found panic particularly useful. He opened a hailing frequency. "This is Nolan Reyes, independent freight operator out of the Kessel Corridor Transit Hub," he said. "I'm operating under Vethori certification, registry number VK7741. I have a navigation discrepancy that I believe it to an outdated beacon relay in this sector. I'm not disputing the territorial boundary. I'd like to correct my heading and continue on my assigned route." There was a pause. Then a response came in on the same frequency, through a translation matrix that handled Crav somewhat better than Vethori. "Freight vessel, you are in contested proximity to Crav territorial boundary. Cut your drive and prepare for boarding inspection." Nolan cut his drive. He was boarded 40 minutes later. 2 Crav inspection officers came aboard in the particular way that Crav inspection officers conducted boardings, which was efficiently and with a clear preference for making the inspected party feel as thoroughly inspected as possible. They were not physically imposing in the way that some coalition species were, but they had a focused and deliberate quality that communicated authority without requiring size to back it up. He gave them his manifest, his certification documentation, his navigation logs, and the beacon relay maintenance report he had pulled from the public registry during the 40-minute wait. He answered their questions accurately and briefly. He did not try to explain the relay discrepancy beyond presenting the documentation, because in his experience, documentation either spoke for itself or it didn't. The senior officer, a Crav official, whose name the matrix handled as Kethvar, went through the documentation with a thoroughness that Nolan respected. She was not looking for reasons to create a problem. She was looking for the truth of what had happened, and she appeared willing to find it wherever the evidence led. 20 minutes into the inspection, she stopped reviewing the documentation and looked at him directly. "This certification," she said. "Vethori Registry, VK7741. Yes, you hold an operator certification from the Vethori Assessment Station in the Kessel Corridor." "I do." She looked at the certification document for a moment. "These are uncommon among human operators." "They are," Nolan agreed. "The Vethori assessment is considered rigorous." "It is." She was studying him with an attention that had shifted subtly from the procedural focus of an inspection officer to something more considered. "Most freight operators in this corridor have standard coalition certification. The Vethori assessment is optional, expensive, difficult. The rates on the Vethori certified contracts are considerably better," Nolan said. "It seemed worth attempting." Kethvar was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What score did you receive?" It was technically information on the certification document she was holding, though it was printed in the secondary data block that most people skimmed past. Nolan had not flagged it. He had simply answered every question accurately. 114, he said. The second inspection officer, who had been reviewing the cargo manifest near the back of the freight bay, stopped moving. Kethvar looked at the document, then back at him. The scale runs to 100, typically, Nolan said. The station director needed to do a manual administrative override on the certification template because the system didn't have a field for higher scores. He said this without emphasis, as a piece of factual information, because that was what it was. The cargo bay was quiet. Kethvar set the certification document down on the manifest table with a care that was not quite matched by the expression on her face, which had done something complicated that Nolan could not read from any translation matrix he had access to. "You are a freight operator," she said. "Yes." "With a Vethori resonance score above the calibrated maximum." "Yes." "And you are hauling," she checked the manifest, "climate control units and seed stock for the outer colony settlements. They needed them before the winter season," Nolan said. "There was a supply delay earlier in the year and the colonists are running short." Kethvar looked at him for a long time. The Crav equivalent of an unreadable expression was very still, very focused, and gave very little away. Nolan had read something about Crav communication in his route documentation and knew that stillness of that quality meant significant internal processing. "The beacon relay discrepancy is documented," she said finally. "The territorial proximity is noted as a navigation error attributable to outdated civilian data. You are free to correct your heading and continue your route." "I appreciate that," Nolan said. The documentation, she picked it up and then set it back down, again in what was clearly not a decisive action, but an uncertain one. "We'll reference the Vethori certification as supporting context." "That's fine." She picked up the certification document one final time and looked at it. Not at the registry number or the authorization seal, but at the score printed in the secondary data block, with an expression that Nolan would think about later, trying to translate it without a matrix to help. "This route," she said. "Outer Veln. You have taken it before?" "First run," Nolan said. "The Kessel Hub coordinator recommended it. Said most pilots found it difficult. And you do not find it difficult." "I find it quiet. I like quiet." Kethvar held the document for one more second, then placed it on the stack with the rest of his paperwork. "Safe transit," she said in a tone that was flat enough to be official and had something else underneath it that the translation matrix declined to categorize. "Thank you," Nolan said. "Same to you." The inspection officers left. Nolan restarted his drive, corrected his heading, and continued on the Outer Veln route. The silence of the corridor settled back around the ship like something returning to its natural state. He made a note in his log about the beacon relay discrepancy, flagged it for submission to the Kessel Hub maintenance registry, and then returned to his route documentation because he was 2 sectors from the outer colony settlements and he liked to know the landing specs in advance. The outer colonies were smaller than he had expected. Most freight documentation described them in the abstract language of settlement coordinates and population figures, and his mental image had defaulted to something more established than the actual reality, which was a cluster of habitat modules in a shallow valley, on a moon that was in the early stages of a terraforming process that would not be complete for another 60 years. The colonists were mostly agricultural technicians and their families. People who had signed on for long-term settlement contracts with the full understanding that the place they were building would not be a comfortable place to live for a long time yet. He liked them immediately. The colony coordinator was a woman named Daisy, and she met his freighter on the landing platform with the particular energy of someone who had been managing a supply deficit for several months and was trying very hard not to show how relieved she was. "You're 2 days ahead of the projected arrival window," she said as her crew began unloading the cargo. "There was a routing delay in the Outer Veln corridor," Nolan said. "I made up some time in the final sectors." "We heard about the Crav proximity incident," Ade said. "Hub coordinator sent a flag, said you handled it." "It was a documentation question. The beacon relay data resolved it." She looked at him with the frank, practical assessment of someone who had spent years in a place where accuracy mattered, and exaggeration was a resource nobody could spare. "The last 2 pilots who hit Crav proximity on the Veln run came back to the hub. Didn't finish the delivery. They had climate control units and seed stock in the cargo bay," Nolan said. "You needed them." Adaze was quiet for a moment. The colony around them was the particular combination of industrial and human that came from people building something from scratch. Functional, unfinished, marked everywhere by the evidence of effort. Are you planning to run this route again? She asked. Probably, Nolan said. The rates are good and I know the corridor now. She nodded, in the tone-neutral way of someone filing information away. I'll put your name down as primary contact for the next requisition. The seed stock needs to be specific to the soil composition here. Most operators don't bother getting the details right. Send me the specifications, Nolan said. I'll match them. The unloading took 3 hours. Nolan spent most of it reviewing his return routing and updating his nav data with the corrected beacon relay information. When the crew finished, Adaze gave him a copy of the colony's supply list for the next shipment and a container of what she called genuine northern coffee, which she said one of the colonists had been growing experimentally and which turned out to be excellent. He flew the return corridor in the same quiet he had come in. The Crav patrol ship was gone. The beacon relay sector was empty and still. Somewhere behind him, the climate control units were being installed before the winter season. The seed stock was being sorted into the colony storage facility. The supply deficit that had been quietly stressing the colonists for months was closed. He drank the coffee and watched the unmapped corridor go by, which was the same as it had been on the way in. Quiet, interesting, and considerably more navigable now that he knew where the relay had been moved. The Coalition research inquiry arrived 6 weeks later, as Dovrak had predicted. It came as a formal communication to his certification registry address, from a Vethori research division, whose full name the translation matrix simplified as the Institute for Cognitive Standards, requesting his participation in a longitudinal study on Veth coherence in non-Vethori populations. Nolan read the communication twice. It was thorough, as Vethori communications tended to be, and it explained clearly that participation was voluntary, that the study was expected to run for several years, and that the data would be used to update the Coalition's understanding of resonance ranges across species. He wrote back accepting, on the condition that the assessment appointments could be scheduled around his freight contracts, because the outer Veln run had turned into a regular route, and Adaz's colony had a spring shipment that needed to be timed correctly. The research division wrote back confirming the scheduling accommodation and noting, with careful Vethori precision, that they considered his condition entirely reasonable. The reply was countersigned by Dovrak, who had apparently followed the case into the research division's files. At the bottom, below the formal authorization, she had added a single line in the secondary notation field, the kind of space usually reserved for administrative flags or reference numbers. It read, "The Outer Veln route. That is a significant choice for a candidate of your assessment profile." Nolan read it twice. Then he wrote back, in the same secondary notation field, "The colonists needed the supply." It seemed like the right run. He sent the reply and went back to his pre-departure checklist, because the Kessel Hub was busy in the early season and he liked to have his nav data confirmed before the corridor traffic built up. The spring shipment left on schedule. The seed stock matched Adaz's soil specifications exactly. Everything else, as it turned out, had been unfolding exactly as it was supposed to all along.